So since we're on the announcements, let me also ask everybody to please make sure that they have their microphone muted during the presentation. We do encourage you to leave your video on because it's easy for the presenter if they are not just looking into a set of black little squares. But you know, it's up to your discretion, obviously. We also have a chat, but the chat is only for everybody. So it's not a private chat, so you can't have little chat conversations with friends. That we cannot really do. In the chat, you'll also see the link to the slides. They can be downloaded from the Glow page. So if you want to download them right away, you can do that as of now. And the way this is going to proceed now is we'll have Charles's presentation, we'll have a couple of discussion points by Hedde afterwards, and then we'll open the floor to a general discussion. At this point, let me also remind people that if you're not a member of Glow yet, and if you enjoy what's going to happen in the next 2 hours, or in general think that generative linguistics is worth supporting, then please consider joining Glow, becoming a member of Glow. All the details are on our webpage. Now, as for this series of glowing lectures, well, the general idea that we had was to make sure that we show why generative linguistics is important, invigorating, and relevant. And so we encourage our guests to talk about what they think everybody should know about a certain subfield, or what they think is exciting about a certain subfield. Now, today's lecture is about phonology, and we're very happy to have Charles Reiss with us from Concordia University in Montreal. Now, Charles, I guess, sees himself first and foremost as a theoretical linguist, but still the issues he works with have an application or an implication for the philosophical side of things. So he also likes to consider the philosophical implications of his phonological research, as well as the implications for linguistics as a cognitive science. Charles has worked on phonology, phonetics, historical linguistics, language acquisition, morphology, a whole range of things. He originally got his BA in mathematics, but then went on to study linguistics at Harvard. And ever since then, he's been very active as a phonologist. So, for example, he's one of the conveners of the biannual North American Phonology Conference since the year 2000, if I'm not mistaken. And the North American Phonology Meeting, or NAFC for short. I mean, even this choice of acronym is not accidental, but phonologically informed, because Charles wanted to show that F, as in NAFC, is completely unremarkable as a cluster in English. So the sequence F, nothing weird about that. Now, many of you might have heard the term substance-free phonology, and Charles, together with Mark Hale, is one of the people responsible for that. And there are at least two ways how this is understood in the field. So some people think it means you can do phonology without any consideration of what actually comes out of your mouth, so that the relationship between the two halves, so to speak, is arbitrary. But Charles once told me over coffee that that's not really what they intended. Really what they meant is you can do phonology without having to worry about what comes out of your mouth. And those are really different things. So it's not completely random, it's just that it's not really relevant. This notion of substance-free phonology also plays a huge role in the 2008 book he published together with Mark Hale, The Phonological Enterprise, which is of interest because they both argue that some very foundational, fundamental questions in phonology are, despite decades of research, unsolved to this point. So I guess we'll hear some more about that today. Charles also is a great and very enthusiastic teacher. He always says he likes wowing his students with all sorts of things like negative polarity items and the cognitive revolution and vowel harmony and finite state machines and what have you. So we're looking forward to see what he has to wow us with today. Now, before I ask him to take it away, one last word, a quick introduction of our discussant. That's Hedde Zeijlstra, who has been professor of linguistics at the Georg August University in Göttingen for, I believe, 13 years or 14? No, long, yeah, something like that. No, 10 years, sorry. He's a semanticist who's worked a lot on negation, on polarity, on agreement, on reference. So in a way, that's going to be very interesting because in a sense, it's kind of the opposite end of the linguistic spectrum, if you so like. So we have a phonologist discussing with a semanticist. So I guess we can look forward to a very interesting lecture. So without further ado, Chance, please take it away.
Right. So everybody can hear me okay and see the slides and everything? Great. Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Marcus. You said a bunch of things I was going to say. And thanks to Susie and Lena and Hedde and Marcus and Andras and all the other people who organized this. And I think it was Kyle Gorman who nominated me for this. So I'm grateful to him. And yeah, I just think this is a great idea. I really enjoyed Laura Kalin's talk. And Marcus made some reference to the book I wrote with Mark Hale. Mark's a historical linguist, and I recently published, well, 5 years ago, published a textbook on phonology with Alan Bale, who's a semanticist. And I wrote a book, the iLanguage book, with Donna Isaac, who's a syntactician. And I've been doing a lot of work with Venno Volinets, who's a phonetician. And so I think this is in the spirit of, or I really like interacting with other linguists. I learn a lot from them. I think it makes me a better phonologist. And so I'm really hoping to try to reach out to the syntax semantics people today, but I'm also very happy to see some of my phonologist friends and some of my former students in the crowd there. So I'll jump in from there. And I think I mentioned to Hedde, if there's something, you know, a tiny question for clarification, you can interrupt me, and then the bigger questions we'll wait till later. Okay, so let me see if I can get my slides. Yeah, that worked. The slides are advancing. Yeah, okay. All right, so my strategy today is going to be to present some conventional point of some conventional wisdom point of phonology. And as Marcus said, I sometimes seem to be kind of iconoclastic, but so I think it's always useful to examine these fundamental ideas. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to present some conventional wisdom on a point of phonology. And then I'm going to offer you an outlandish and idiosyncratic alternative. So I don't want you to think that, you know, that any of my friends out there agree with this stuff, but I think it's worth revisiting these basic points and keeping an open mind. So just to quote Edward Tolman, who is a psychologist, in his paper, Cognitive Maps in Rats and Men, my arguments will be brief, cavalier, and dogmatic. I don't really expect to be able to convince you all of my strange point of view here. But I do hope to foster discussion after the talk, but also with you syntax semantics people to talk to some of your phonologist colleagues more. So I've chosen the title Rational Phonology to suggest various things like the rationalism, empiricism issue that we all know from theoretical linguistics. And as Marcus mentioned, I'm interested in this focus on kind of the logic of phonology, not on phonetic substance. And I'm going to try to argue that these things really need to be divorced. So this is in line with what sometimes is called the Concordia Substance-Free Phonology School. Mark Hale and Alan Bale and Venno Volinets and I and some of our students have been working on this. Okay, so I think competing frameworks, there's different approaches to features and so on. And you might wonder, well, why are you assuming this or that or the other? But I think they're basically incommensurable. So you're stuck with my perspective today, and we'll see if it can bring us to something interesting. And but for the big GLOW theme and the theme of these lectures, I really do want to show the unity of linguistics. And one way to do this is by taking quotations from Chomsky that were made in the context, mostly he was talking about syntax or linguistics generally, but show that they're equally applicable when we're talking about phonology. So I'm going to try to show the unity of linguistics. So let's start with something outrageous, the relationship between phonetics and phonology. So basically, the conventional wisdom is that you can't do phonology without phonetics, right? The phonology depends on phonetics, and that you can observe segments and features in the signal, but I'm going to say nay to this. And it's just common sense, right? Think of your course curriculum. At my university, phonetics is linguistics 372 and phonology is linguistics 373. That's pretty much universal, right? Every department, you start with introduction to phonetics, then you go to phonology, or every textbook goes in that order. So just, a reflection of this perspective is this quote in Anderson's Organization of Phonology from Henry Sweet, He says phonetics is useless in itself, but it's the foundation of all study of language, whether theoretical or practical. And in contrast to this, I give you a quote from one of my intellectual heroes, who was a rationalist phonetician. And he says, actually, phonology is logically and epistemologically prior to phonetics. In other words, you can't do phonetics without phonology. So I'm going to spend a little time trying to convince you that Hammerberg is actually right. In a discussion of poverty to stimulus, Howard Lasnik says, Chomsky gets criticized for these abstract notions like these, C command and transformations and sentences and WH movement, these very abstract things. But he says that's not the big step. The big step is going from noise to word, right? As you know, in the signal, there's not necessarily a silence between words, like between the vowel of the and the S of spotted, that we see here. And then there is silence inside of words between the S and the P of spotted, because P is a stop consonant. There's absolutely no sound while you're making the closure for the P. And so the word boundaries are not derivable from the signal. They're not out there in the world. And I think it's worth mentioning, I once told this to a bunch of engineers and physicists that I was helping write a grant for a photonic neural net voice analyzing system. And they were blown away by this. And they insisted on putting this point into their grant application. So I think it's important not to undervalue the things that we know about language, and realize that even highly educated, highly intelligent people basically know nothing about language. And we got to keep this stuff in mind and be proud of it. So I think Howard Lasnik is actually not being radical enough. I think he would agree with me if I said that actually there's this kind of poverty to the stimulus everywhere. In all the phonological patterns we look at, syllables aren't out there, segments aren't out there, features aren't out there, and we've got to push it further. Okay, so the idea is that the rationalist perspective is going to beat the empiricist perspective in the end, or that's the position we're going to take. So I just want to show you that this is not just restricted to language. Zenon Polishin, in his book Computation and Cognition, makes this point about vision. He says the equivalence classes, the categories or the features, if you will, of vision are not stimulus bound. You can't define necessary and sufficient conditions to define a Necker cube. You can make a Necker cube you can make people see a Necker cube with this or with this. And even this is I really like this example, because you can make a Necker cube that changes perspectives, even though the lines themselves are products of your mind, right? The lines, the edges of the lines can't be found with a photometer. And so you've got these constructed by your mind lines that can make this Necker cube that can change perspectives. So the same is true of a syllable or a T or an A or a noun phrase or a subject. Basically all the categories we deal with work like this. So Hammerberg, to continue, I really like this guy's work. He says that the concept of the segment, which is indispensable to phonetics and phonology, is a creature of the paradigm. It's part of our theory. It's not in the raw data. And then from the perspective of the human, right, in cognitive science, we're always talking about rationalism and empiricism in terms of the practice of science, but also in from the point of view of the learner, right? So he says it has to be obvious that segments don't exist outside of the human mind. They're, imposed on the signal by the mind. Okay, so let's just make this more concrete. Imagine a Hammerbergian Martian comes down, and you're going to have to look at me closely and sees me saying something like keep, 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 where the first sound is keep, and versus coop, 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 where I'm going. So I'm going versus what is that Martian going to say? I'm making, one of the Ks is more front, the tongue is more forward and the lips are spread. The other one, the tongue is a little bit back and the lips are rounded. Is the Martian going to just say, he just did the same thing twice? Well, probably not, right? Because the Martian is observing this person who's rounding their lips versus spreading their lips. And so Hammerberg's point is basically that you can't talk about a rounded K or an unrounded K or a fronter K or a backer K without the pre-existing category K. So you need the phonological category to talk about phonetic variants within that category. Okay, so this is not just Hammerberg who says this. So in the spirit of the Christmas season, Chomsky likes to say similar things about the syllable ba. That seems to be his favorite example. He says, no one's so deluded as to believe that there's a mind-independent object corresponding to the syllable ba, some construction from motion of molecules or something. And again, he says, it's idle to seek a mind-independent construct that corresponds to the syllable ba. Of course, what he means when he says no one is so deluded is there are lots of deluded people who do this all the time, but they're wasting their time, they're being idle. It's this, the idea is that it's our cognoscative powers that make us parse a signal as a syllable ba. It's not something out there in the world. Again, this predates Chomsky, of course. Even Sapir generalized this. He said, no entity in human experience, no category of human experience can be adequately defined as the mechanical sum or product of its physical properties. And his famous example was define the difference between a club and a pole. You can't reduce that to its physical properties, its weight, the material. It basically depends on what you use the thing for. So to come back to phonology, imagine again a Martian scientist who comes down and sees a language where people use the sound X and it occurs before an E, U, A, or a word boundary. And they got the sound Y that occurs before P, T, K, and so on. Let's say they've learned a little bit of linguistics, this Martian scientist, but they're trying to figure out if they can derive these from a single underlying segment. And sometimes when we teach this in intro, we tell our students, well, choose as the underlying form the one that occurs in more environments, right? The question is, what do we mean by more? Well, 14, like PTK and so on, is more than EUA word boundary, right? 14 is bigger than 4, so should Y be the underlying form? Well, it's actually got to be X because, in fact, Y occurs in one environment. It occurs before a consonant. And X occurs in 2 environments, before a vowel or before the end of a word. And so that category of consonant has to be there to see the generalization, right? It's only if you have the category consonant as a linguist or as a baby that you can make the right generalization. Okay, and I just want to be clear, I'm not going to show you spectrograms, but you can't really get this from the signal. If you made the spectrogram of an A, an N, an R, an L, and a V, they would be kind of similar. You'd see form and structure, you'd see voicing. And the spectrograms of P, S, and K would be very different from all of those. And so this category of consonant has to be there in the theory, in the paradigm, or in UG. It has to be available to the learner. Okay, so Howard's big leap, I think he said big step actually, also applies from noise to syllable or noise to feature. These things are not in the signal, just like the words aren't in the signal. Okay, so just to make an argument from authority, and linguists don't feel like, okay, this is just crazy, Chomsky saying, obscure things. This is a general idea in philosophy of science. Heisenberg and Einstein were having a conversation, and Heisenberg said, a good theory must be based on directly observable magnitudes. And Einstein said, well, you don't really believe that. And Heisenberg said, isn't that what you did with relativity? And Einstein said, well, maybe I did use that kind of reasoning, but it's nonsense. In reality, the opposite happens. It's the theory which decides what we can observe. So, we're not coming out from left field by, Hammerberg and Chomsky's view on this. And in the same way, it's UG, it's the initial set of available categories that decide what kids can learn. So the rational phonology view, in response to this common sense idea that we see reflected in curriculums and books, is that you can't do phonetics without phonology, and we need to build a UG theory that has all these features and categories that we think the learner has access to. So phonetics is actually grounded in phonology, which is the contrary to what the conventional wisdom is, and all these categories are not out there. So you need, there's an argument for innate phonological primes to even begin acquiring a language. So to this, I say I. Okay, so that's my first naysaying topic. The next one, it's long. I you can see there's a subsection about justifying the existence of features. This is there because the last talk I gave, I guess he was a computational linguist, syntactician, just told me, well, you can just do all this with segments. What do you need features for? So I guess you can't take it for granted that people understand or accept why we use features. So I'll just give you a quick a hint of what we use them for. And like I've said, there's other feature models out there. You're just going to have to accept mine for today. Okay, so the conventional wisdom about this is that somehow phonological UG maybe has to have a lot of stuff in it, a lot of features, or a lot of other things, because there's a lot of languages. And so maybe we need a lot of constraints, or maybe we need an extra module of phonetic spell out. So a language specific to each language, a spell out module that's not universal. And there's also this idea that underspecification, which I'll describe in a few moments, is this kind of abstract, complicated idea. Partly we think about it that way because we tend to learn about it late. We don't get introduced to underspecification right away when we're learning phonology. But I'm going to say nay to all these things. Okay, so let's look at some data. Here's the 8 Turkish vowels. Maybe they're all 8 of them, but we'll question that later. And I won't pronounce these for you, but you can see there's 8 different vowels here. And somehow you're probably familiar with the fact that phonologists like to categorize speech segments in terms of these binary features. So you got the minus back sounds, or the front vowels, and the plus back ones. You got the high ones and the minus high ones, and then you've got this rounding distinction. So with these 3 different features, you can get 8 possible vowels. And there's a complicated relationship between these symbolic representations in terms of features and how they're realized with your mouth. So, for example, the U and the O that Ezgi is making here, both are called plus round, but in fact, there's different muscles being involved in the rounding of an U and the rounding of an O because of the height of the jaw due to the height difference. So they don't exactly correspond to what's going on phonetically. Okay, so the theory that I'm going to adopt is that a segment is basically just a set of these features, or these valued features. And I'm going to assume for today that they're consistent. So you can have plus F for a feature and minus F. So a vowel can be plus high or minus high, but not both. And so basically this is what a segment is. It's a set of these ordered pairs, a value plus a feature. So E is minus back, minus round, plus high, and so on. So this should be very familiar. And here's a bunch of here's another list of Turkish words with singulars and plurals. And what you notice is that the vowel of the plural suffix is an E, like in devler or kekler, or an A, as in canlar or tarzlar. And the vowel of the suffix is identical to the vowel of the root, actually the preceding vowel, let's say. And so even something as simple as this, I think we can learn a lot from. And it's, we shouldn't devalue these simple results. So we see that the vowel of the suffix is identical. And so that's a discovery, right, of some kind, that phonology can compute identity. And but we can take this further. If we go back to our initial list of Turkish words with different vowels, I, and U, and so on, we no longer have identity in the plural, but we still have just ler and lar. And it turns out that the vowel of the suffix is identical to the preceding vowel, but only with respect to the feature plus or minus back. So I, E, U, and Ö are the minus back, or the front vowels, and U, O, U, and A are the back vowels. And that's what determines the choice of suffix. So again, this is a big discovery. I mean, I think Ray Jackendorf in his book, Patterns in the Mind, says that the discovery of features he considers to be on a par with the discovery of the periodic table of the elements. So not only that phonology can compute identity, but that segments aren't the atoms of computation. It's these valued features that are the atoms, because the computation of identity has to be done in terms of these subsegmental properties. And so the perspective we're taking is that it's these innate set of features determines what are the possible patterns, what are the possible equivalence classes. You can't reduce this to physiology or acoustics, because you remember for making plus round, Esgy uses different muscles for an U versus an O. So we can do even more with, we'll go on with features a bit more. I'm trying to hide this thing. Okay. So we consider the situation of a kid learning lexical items. And if they learn something like, he went to the park, they can easily ask a question like, he went to the park, right? Which means every time you hear a word like park or dog or dance or whatever, it's got some intonation pattern on it, right? It's got some intonation, but what they must store is something that's extracted the information, the intonation out, and you store something that's intonation-less, and the intonation gets mapped onto the word. And so, you can teach a kid a new word. You can say, he saw a pangolin, and the kid can say, what's a pangolin, with rising intonation, right? So they store something they've never heard, and we can make a similar suggestion. Did that screen, do you see a big diagram now? Yeah, okay. The same thing happens with Turkish vowels. So that this is not necessarily the case, but there's arguments that actually the plural has yet another vowel, a different vowel, not one of the 8 surface vowels. I'm calling it capital A. And it's always unrounded. It's always minus high, but it either shows up as minus back or plus back, depending on the vowel in the preceding syllable. And so this is an example of underspecification where the vowel of the suffix actually is lacking a value for certain features. Okay, so there's many justifications and uses for underspecification, but that's all I'll give you today. So there's a recent article in the New York Times 2 weeks ago, exactly how much life is on Earth, and a group of biologists and geologists computed that there's a trillion or 10 to the 30th living cells currently on Earth, and that's more than there are stars in the universe or grains of sand on our planet. And what I'm going to try to show you is that this is just kid stuff compared to what we can do with underspecification and features. Okay. All right. So remember, I said a segment is just a set of features. So UG, look at this UG. It doesn't have much. Some set of features. Usually people say 20 or 25. They just make that number up, but that's good enough for our purposes. And some values that can be matched with those. And for now, like I said, we're just going to treat segments as sets of these valued features, and they don't have inconsistent values in them for now, and they're not necessarily complete. So we're going to allow underspecification, like that capital A is a vowel of Turkish. It happens to surface as either E or A after the phonology applies. So here's a possible segment. Let's say we have just 3 features. Here's a possible segment that has specification for F1, F2, and F3, but here's another possible segment. A value for F1 happens to be missing. So as I said, we've got this Turkish example, and there's many other situations where underspecification can really simplify analyses, make it not necessary to refer to exceptional roots or exception features or lexical exceptions. All right, so let's just imagine there's just 4 features, right? This is just unrealistically small for universal grammar. That gives us 81 possible segments, because each segment is either plus F, minus F, or F is absent for each of the features. And so for F1, that's the case. For F2, that's the case. So we get 3 by 3 by 3 by 3 is 83 to the 4th possible segments. And there are some examples. But just with those 81 segments, how many possible languages do you get? Well, you got a universal segment inventory. And if you think of a language as a segment inventory, it means it's got a subset of the universal segment inventory. So you just got to take the power set, all the possible subsets of the universal segment inventory. And for each segment, you say, is A in the language? Is U in the language? Is P in the language? Is T in the language? So you got these 81 yes/no questions, and you get 2 to the 81st power, which is it's 2.4 septillion segment inventories from a UG that just has 4 features. And if you, that's already 1,000 times more than the number of grains of sand on Earth. And if you take something more realistic for phonological features, where you say you have 20 of them, then you get 3 to the 20th possible segments, which means you get 2, which is over a billion, it's about 3.5 billion, which means you got over 2 to the billionth power languages from a UG that has just 20 features. So this is really nice. This doesn't tell us exactly what the features are. It doesn't prove that UG is correct, but it really is a good plausibility argument. It turns out the number of particles in the universe is just 2 to the 285th. So like I said, that's kid stuff compared to what we get with our tiny little UG here. So under specification means allow nothing, allow the absence, and it gives us a lot. So one lesson from this is that any combinatoric system is going to overgenerate in some sense. We don't expect our theory to match the existing data. This is very different from the idea of factorial typology and optimality theory, where they really want the theory to match the range of attested variation. And like I said, there's this prejudice against under specification that it's abstract and complex, but I want to argue that it's actually more elegant to use under specification. And there's a parallel in Chomsky's discussion of the collapsing of merge and move. So first of all, it's good to be able to get a lot from a little, right? So the less we attribute to genetic information. If we just have to put 20 features in the genome, that's kind of nice. That means it's very feasible to study its evolution and its neural instantiation. But we can get a lot of variety from a small UG, right? We don't need to get have a lot in there to get a lot of typological distinctions. And this also provides an argument against language-specific phonetics. It should now be the null hypothesis that if 2 languages have 2 E's, what we call the E of German and the E of Spanish, they could be featurally distinct. That should be our null hypothesis, because just with, say, 6 vowels, you get 3 to the 6 segments, 6 vowel features, you get 3 to the 6 different vowels. And so the vowel triangle gets pretty crowded. There's a lot of room for specified differently vowels without going to language-specific phonetics. Okay. All right. So here's what I mentioned, that the idea of merge and move. So Chomsky makes this point that it was a mistake to suppose that displacement or move is an imperfection of language. And so basically what he had to do was get rid of the stipulation that to do a merge, you got to go out back to the numeration or the lexical array. And he barred internal merge, right? Once you get rid of that, then you get rid of that stipulation, and movement comes for free. And so the idea here is that making progress may not require a good new idea. It might just be a matter of getting rid of a bad idea, that you got to go back to the lexical array, or that segments should somehow have to be specified for each feature. So if we get rid of that idea in phonology, then under specification comes for free, and we have a stripped down version of feature theory, but it gives us a lot more power. So we just get rid of the stipulation. Okay, so I can't see, there we go. So the rational phonology view is that features are the real atoms of phonological computation. Under specification is analytically useful in many ways. I've only shown you one example. Sharon Inkelis is probably the most important person who's made suggestions in this domain. And it gives us the good kind of combinatoric explosion that Gallistill and King talk about in their book, that any kind of cognitive system needs to have. So we just remove the stipulation of completeness, and we don't need language-specific phonetics. So I'm going to say I to this instead of the conventional wisdom. Okay, I'm just going to check the time. Okay, so the next point is fairly short. Okay, ontologies versus epistemic toolkits. So here's another piece of conventional wisdom, that phonology is concerned with minimal pairs and contrast. So you syntax semantics people out there, maybe the only thing you remember about phonology is minimal pairs are important, and complementary distribution or something like that. And I'm going to say nay to this. Sorry. Well, not completely nay. We got to make a distinction between the discipline of phonology, which is what I practice, what I get paid to do, versus what a grammar is, what's a phonological grammar. Okay, and so that's part of a cyclotron, and that's a minimal pair. What I want to say is that phonology has minimal pairs like physics has cyclotrons, right? They're tools that we can use to make hypotheses. Well, minimal pairs help us make hypotheses about what's in somebody's grammar, what's a lexical contrast. But the phonology itself doesn't, the actual grammar doesn't care about contrast. It doesn't have to care about, it doesn't care about ambiguity and homophony and things like that. In fact, phonology has neutralization. And just like syntax can give rise to structural ambiguity through movement or through different tree structures, there's lots of ambiguity and homophony in the inputs of phonology, but also as a result of the workings of the phonology. So we got to distinguish the sources of evidence, how we figure stuff out about grammars, like we might use minimal pairs, but that's not what the grammars themselves aren't doing that. So I say aye to this. There's lots of people will disagree with that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about assimilation and household pets. So you might think, oh, finally, somebody's going to talk about this. People looking, but it's nothing to do with dogs and their owners looking alike. Here's another thing. Oh, maybe you syntax semantics people remember how important assimilation is when you study phonology. And Turkish vowel harmony was an example of assimilation. And this idea that stuff that's common, like assimilation, should be easy to account for. It's important, but I'm going to say nay to this too. Okay, so here's two views on the what's the goal of phonology or what's the goal of linguistics. And I think that this passage by McCarthy, I mean, I used to believe this wholeheartedly. I think it's a good example of the fetishization of assimilation by phonologists. He says the goal of phonology is the construction of a theory in which cross-linguistically common and well-established processes emerge from very simple combinations of the descriptive parameters of the model. So, N assimilating to the place of articulation of a following stop is very common, so the theory should make it easy to do that. That's why we have feature geometry and autosegmental spreading. But I don't think this makes sense anymore, right? So the Big Bang happened once, leaves fall many times every year, every day. Do we want a theory of physics that accounts for falling leaves more easily than accounts for the Big Bang? Probably not. And, think about this in syntax. On the one hand, do support, let's say, is only in English. Should it be hard to model do support? On the other hand, do support, as English becomes an international language, more and more people speak it, should it become easier to account for do support? It doesn't really make sense, right? If it's a possible grammar, if it's part of a possible grammar, the theory has to deal with it. The commonness or the well-establishedness, whatever that means, shouldn't be relevant to how hard or easy it is to model things. I'm not even sure what this means. So instead, I want to adopt this approach that the goal is to abstract from the welter, the morass, the chaos of descriptive complexity, some general principles that govern computation that allows the rules of any particular language to be given in very simple forms. So we don't favor the common stuff. So let's look at an assimilation rule. So it looks like copy or assimilate or harmonize seems to really be a thing, right? If we have E becomes nasalized E before an N. So what's going on here is something like a vowel looks at the segment to its immediate right, and if it finds plus nasal, it copies that feature or it agrees with that feature in some sense. But we tend to teach these examples and focus a lot on these examples, but there's just as many examples of this. E becomes I before an N. So you're searching, the vowel is searching to its immediate right, it finds plus nasal, and then the vowel becomes plus high. And there's no good reason to say that nasals are all plus high. If you don't like this example, there's many, many others. So we need something much more abstract, like rules have the form like, okay, a vowel searches to its right, and if it finds plus nasal, then something happens to the vowel. That's the level at which we need to formula. That's what the building blocks of phonology have to look for. What kind of things can happen like this? So we just need to distinguish the environment of a rule and the change that happens. They're two different things. What you look for, what you're searching for, what defines the environment is not the same as what happens. It might involve nasalizing, it might involve raising, or whatever, right? There could be dissimilation, for example. So how do we get back to household pets? Well, household pets are things like goldfish, turtles, and dogs, and terrestrial mammals are things like elephants, rabbits, and wolves. They're not a natural class. So Chomsky, talking about science trying to carve nature at its joints, says that in principles and parameters, syntacticians rejected the idea of rules and constructions like relative clauses in Hindi, verb phrases in Swahili, passives in Japanese. And he says that these grammatical constructions are taxonomic artifacts useful for informal description, but with no theoretical standing. It's like the status of terrestrial mammal or household pet. And so what I want to say is things like assimilation and vowel harmony are like passives and relative clauses in syntax. And we have to see beyond these taxonomic artifacts and get more general or more basic. So the rational phonology view is that assimilation doesn't exist except to describe the accidental cases where what you're looking for, what is sought, and what happens happen to be the same, happen to be partially the same. When I'm looking for a nasal and I nasalize, that's assimilation, but that's no special status. Alpha notation, which you all know about, is a separate matter. But assimilation is not a particular concept or category in phonological grammars. And it happens a lot because of the nature of language change, maybe, but that shouldn't color the model that we build. Okay, so to this I say aye. All right, so let's try to see if we can put some meat on this. Right, if simulation was really different, it would require different tools from other processes. That would be the conventional wisdom. Simulation rules are different from other kinds of rules. And I'm going to say nay to this, that basically everything involves the same toolkit. So I'm just going to introduce these diagrams. I call them segment mapping diagrams, and they're just part of our epistemic toolkit. The grammar doesn't use these, but it's just a way to show that you can have underlying segments like our Turkish A, capital A and E, and how they map by the phonology to the surface representations. So you have a three-way underlying distinction that maps to a two-way surface distinction. Okay, so to make this more general, let's just look at the logic of this. Instead of A, capital A and E, what I want is three segments that are different in very simple way that basically, phi has a feature, let's say plus F, get rid of that and you get delta, which is underspecified or unspecified for F. And then you've got the psi, which is minus F. And so if you get rid of minus F, it's equivalent to delta. Or another way to look at it is if we just took the intersection of these two segments, you get something that lacks their point of disagreement and is underspecified. So with this abstract notation, we can see that lots and lots of processes start looking, we can start breaking down pretty much all changes within a segment to a couple of simple rules. So we're basically deconstructing the arrow of phonological rules. We're not doing everything now, but we're going to start with this to two basic operations. So one is a unification operation, which is pretty close to set union. I'm not going to tell you how it differs for now. And the other is based on set subtraction. Remember, we're saying segments are sets, so we can do set theoretic operations on them. And, on the one hand, so basically what I'm saying is we can do everything we want to change X into Y by either adding stuff or taking stuff away. And that becomes kind of obvious when you say it. To change it, a segment into another segment, you just got to take away some things and add some other things. But with Alan Bale and David Shen, we've proposed that actually we can make some pretty specific claims about these things, like the unify operations seem to have to apply to a singleton set. You can only add one feature at a time, which of course Chomsky said something like this in 1964. So it looks like very close to what he proposed. But the subtraction operation, we think, has to subtract a bunch of features at a time. And this has to do with becoming more or less specific and how natural classes get referred to. But I just want to add these details because this looks so trivial if I just tell you we're adding stuff and subtracting stuff. There's more we can say about it. Okay, so again, we're just trying to abstract from the welter some general principles. So let's look at a traditional rule like final devoicing in Russian, where a voiced D becomes a voiceless T. And what we're going to do is we're going to adopt this old trick of making it a two-step process where basically you start with the D, you subtract the plus voiced, and then you get this capital D, which is unspecified for voicing, and then you add in minus voiced. And so you've got this two-step process using unification and subtraction rules. Things can get more interesting when you get something that I call reciprocal neutralization. You've got roots like kut and kad, and this is actually very confusing for students to figure out the underlying forms here, because you know that you see that the word for well can have a D sometimes and a T sometimes, and the word for tub can have a D sometimes and a T sometimes. So they both have alternates with T and alternates with D, but there are environments where one of them has a T and the other is a D. So they've got to be different. They behave differently, so they've got to be underlyingly different. So the pattern you need is something like this, where sometimes D becomes T and T becomes D. And we can break this down with our unification and subtraction rules into something like this. So things are starting to get more complex, where T before a voiced segment becomes a capital D, but D before a voiceless segment becomes a capital D. So the two kind of merge together in the underspecified segment, and then they split again according to the context through the unification rules. So that things get a little more interesting. And so you can imagine that we've got combinatorics of a simple system, and we can do a lot with this. So again, to generalize, things Chomsky said about syntax, as concepts and principles become simpler, we're going to have to be more clever, or the inferences are going to become more complex, and that's exactly what we expect. That's exactly what we hope when we're making scientific progress. A simple theory can lead to phenomenological complexity. So just because the phonology problems get harder to solve doesn't mean we need a more complex model. We just got to be more clever in how we use the pieces that we're proposing. So I gave you this kind of simplified version of this Hungarian reciprocal crisscrossing neutralization, but Hungarian has some exceptional or feature segments that behave in different ways. Like Hungarian V can be a target of devoicing. It can devoice to F, but it doesn't trigger devoicing. So it doesn't turn the T before it into a D. So it doesn't fit in with the other obstruent segments. And don't worry too much about the details, but we can build this into our model and just choose our pieces cleverly. So this delta here is unspecified for voicing. Maybe that would correspond to, that's one way to deal with the behavior of Hungarian V. So the details are in a paper. You don't need to get them now. But let's just look at more things you can get. Here's an example. I was wondering if this occurred. And in fact, I wrote an email once to Pat Keating, who's like the queen of surface under specification. And I asked her, is it possible? So Pat Keating had shown that you can have under specification that persists into the output. So in Turkish, we started with capital A, but it gets filled in with plus or minus back by the end of the derivation. But Pat Keating showed that sometimes under specification can persist to the surface. And so I was wondering, could there be derived surface under specification, where you start out with fully specified segments, but then you end up with something unspecified, underspecified on the surface? And it turns out people kind of had said this before, but not formalized in this subtract and unify system. And Pat Keating didn't give me an example, and I couldn't come up with an example. But then recently at the Manchester phonology meeting, Johanna Benz and Veno Volonets pointed out that this perfectly expresses debuccalization, where you have in certain languages where you have all the glottalized consonants like K and D and so on, they all become glottal stop in coda. So let's say you have a glottalized K and a glottalized P, and they lose their place of articulation and they just become glottal stops. So you basically end up with under specification for the place of articulation features. So I was wondering using this model, I said, well, there's nothing to rule out something like this. And then Johanna and Venno, lo and behold, they found an example. And so it shows up. It seems to show up. And what about something like this? So this says you've got two fully specified segments. One of them becomes underspecified and then merges with the other one by having the opposite feature filled in. Now, what in the world could ever make you want to posit something like this, right? Why would you ever posit that you've got phi, phi, phi? Why would you say, well, sometimes phi is from psi? And it turns out that this too seems to be something that, people have said this before, but I'm just putting it in my terms here. Hungarian has vowels that seem to act, that are exceptional with respect to vowel harmony. So you've got E's or I's, well, I'm going to call them E's, I'll pronounce them. You have E's as in V's that take front harmony, but you've got E's as in heed that take back harmony. And one way to do this is to say that the two vowels start out with opposite values. Vowel harmony applies, and then you delete the plus back on the barred I, and you turn it into a front vowel, and they merge together. And so there's nothing wrong with, the model doesn't rule that out, right? We just have mappings from one level to another with these two very basic operations. So we've got vowel harmony triggered by Turkish, then a subtraction rule, and we can do this very simply with the tools that we already have. Now, there's a long debate in the literature about should this kind of absolute neutralization be allowed? And there's a way to turn the question around and say, well, is it even possible to rule it out? And do we want to rule it out? It doesn't make our model any more complicated. We just have insertion and deletion of features, and that's all we need. So why would we want to rule this out? And look, here's an example where it works for us. And, it's not really surprising because we don't want the essence of things, like what's the underlying form of a segment, to be only decided by how it looks, but also by its effect on other things. So if we have a vowel that's causing back harmony, why not say it's different from a vowel that sounds alike but is causing front harmony? So it's pretty. I mean, to me, it seems very commonsensical, right? It's only it's again this idea of well, I think I'm going to say this later. Like, it would be hard to rule this out and have a coherent model. Okay, so we've got derived surface under specification. We've got this absolute neutralization type situation. We've got reciprocal neutralization, but all from the same simple model. So, the idea is don't just try to fit the data, right? We got to become clever. And I would think it would be kind of hard to rule out these situations. Again, to make a parallel in syntactic structures, Chomsky talks about the fact that, yeah, sure, every sentence you come across has a pretty small length, like maybe 100 words at most. But if you tried to make a syntactic theory that would limit the length of sentences or limit the number of embeddings that you can have, you would get something that's a theory that's of little use and of little interest. So the assumption that languages are infinite, well, you don't in this sense, is made to simplify the description of these languages. So by not having stipulations against absolute neutralization, you get a simple, formally interesting model. So the complex stuff may turn out to be attested. It tells us what to look for, but it also gives us a, kind of simple, interesting theory. So the rational phonology view is to abstract from the welter of descriptive complexity, get useful grammars, and this is what I say I to. Okay, so Hedde, I've been talking, actually, when did I think I've been talking for about 50 minutes already.
That's right, 50 minutes, yes.
Yes.
So maybe I definitely shouldn't finish. Should I let you, do you want to choose what we do? Maybe I'll do the, should I take 10 more minutes or should I stop?
10 should be fine, I think.
I
Okay,
think it should be fine. Take your 10 minutes and then
I'll take the next 10. I'll skip
Yeah.
the poverty. I'll
Okay.
skip the last section. Okay. So another conventional wisdom notion everybody wants their phonological rules to be local. The idea is that locality is an essential idea of phonology. And we try to either have actual string-wise locality, or as Laura Kalin she described this attempt to make locality hold by having different tiers in the phonology. And so locality is just taken for granted as to be something that we should always aim for in phonological rules. And guess what? I'm going to say nay to this too. And I'm going to say that we don't need locality at all. Okay, so this is based on work I started 20 years ago with Fred Maillot, and I've been working on this with some other people like David Shen and Rim Dabous and Marjorie Leduc. So, so this is going to be a very informal hint of how you might go about this. Okay, so here's 3 kinds of languages. So this is based pretty much on some Bantu cases. So there are languages like Lamba, these are made up forms, where you have something like Pamila shows up as Pamina. So it's almost local. So basically this L becomes an N. L and N are both nasals. L becomes an N if the first consonant to the left, or if the onset of the preceding syllable, or some, let's just say the first consonant to the left is a nasal. And if you have the nasal further away, you don't get the assimilation. So you got Masatila comes out as Masatila. And so maybe the M is too far away, or maybe the S and the T are opaque. There's different ways of thinking about this. But it turns out nicely that there are languages where you get long distance nasal assimilation. So like Chiluba, if you had Pamila, you get Pamina again. But if you have Masatila, you get Masatina. So you get long distance nasal assimilation as a possibility. And then of course you have languages. So in this case, maybe the S and the T are transparent. Of course, you have phonological phenomena where actual absolute segment adjacency is required, right? L becomes N only if it's right after an M, for example. So to give you a sense of how we deal with this, I'm going to give you an analogy. So imagine you're standing in line for a movie or something, and you say, if I tell you, okay, look ahead of you until you find a man, and if that man's wearing a hat, take his hat. Right? So you got to search the line until you find a man, as opposed to scan ahead of you in line until you find a man with a hat and take his hat. Right? So these are different, right? Because if the first man you find doesn't have a hat, you don't end up with one. In case 2, you're going to look until you find a man with a hat. So it's basically an issue of the scope of hat having is what we're looking at here. And then you can have, for absolute adjacency, look at the person in front of you. If they're wearing a hat, take it. These all lead to different possible outcomes. And so that's what we're going to, that's basically how we deal with these local and long distance effects. And let me be a little bit more specific about that it's about the scope of conditions. That adjacency in this case, only assimilate if the thing is right next to you, is the case of the minimally restrictive terminator of your search, right? So just look at the person in front of you, or just look at the segment next to you. So you find a segment or find a person, that's as general as you can get. And that means stop searching then. If you're more specific, right? If it says don't terminate until you find a man with a hat or a nasal consonant, right? So don't search until you find a plus nasal consonantal segment or a person who's a man and has a hat. That's going to allow the search to go on further. So what the view we're taking is that rules encode independent specifications for what initiates a search, the direction of the search, what terminates the search, whether a terminator triggers a change, and so on, what the change is. And it's just combinatorics of these basic parameters that give us a welter of surface patterns. And this gives us a way to unify. We don't need this notion of locality. Locality kind of turns out to be a third factor issue. Basically, it follows from since you're searching through an ordered string, you get locality just by virtue of saying search and terminate when you find what you're looking for. Okay, so locality falls out. And some people have pointed out that there's some similarities to this kind of search algorithm to work by Amy Rose Deal. I think it really looks very similar, but I think there's also important differences because of how she's interested in feature checking and so on. But it might be worth pursuing. So to this, I say aye. Okay, so last section we'll do is an argument against constraint-based notions in phonology and maybe everywhere in linguistics. Again, this is obviously not widely accepted, but the conventional wisdom is that the phonology repairs somehow, ill-formed or marked or pathological or complex representations. McCarthy, discussing the conspiracy literature in rule-based phonology, says that you can't create bad syllables. The phonology shouldn't create bad syllables. Moira Yip says phonological computation has to cure a condition. The OT literature started out saying that there's principles of well-formedness that somehow make representations better, more harmonic or optimal. There's talk of repair strategies or output drivenness, trying to make the output be of a certain unmarked type. So I'm going to say nay to all this. And I'm going to say it's all teleological. It's all driven by purpose, that things like epenthesis exists to eliminate bad syllables, or maintain contrast constraints exist to avoid homophony, that the obligatory contour principle exists to cure a condition, as Moira Yip says. And I don't think grammars have goals or purposes or aims or motivations. The fact that there's neutralization and that movement can cause quantifier scope ambiguities show that these claims aren't no better than teleological arguments in other domains. The idea that a lantern shines so that we don't stumble. I think these all reflect a kind of teleology. Lanterns don't care about stumbling, and grammars don't care about ambiguity or anything else, right? It is the way it is. The grammar has its rules, and there's no rhyme or reason to it in the synchronic grammar. Okay, Morris Halle kind of viewed things this way. He said, he worked as an engineer for a decade, he once told me, trying to, find functionalist and information theoretic arguments in support of or about the nature of phonology. But he ended up concluding that language is not in its essence a means for transmitting cognitive information. We use it for that purpose, but actually languages have much ambiguity and redundancy and other properties that are undesirable in a good communication code. And if you think about it, there's, impossible objects can be represented by the visual system, like the triangle or an Escher staircase that is always ascending or always descending. And our visual system can deal with these things. It doesn't repair them. So it seems that this notion of ill-formedness is unfounded. We can have representations of impossible, things that can't exist. And another kind of conceptual argument against constraint satisfaction models is that, if you think of where we use them, right, to solve Sudoku or traveling salesman problem or wiring of transistors or scheduling classrooms in a university, these are all artifacts. And if language is a natural object, maybe it shouldn't be modeled with constraint satisfaction models. It's nowhere, we don't use that in biology or physics. I mean, people sometimes talk in terms of constraint satisfaction models, but the actual theories don't rely on those. I think that this might be an indication that they're on the wrong track. Another issue is that constraints can be learned by negative evidence, but we tend to think that negative evidence is not available to the learner. They can't be learned by positive evidence because maybe tomorrow you'll find a violation. So they force an implausibly rich theory of UG, right? It's not feasible from the evolutionary perspective, as Chomsky pointed out. You don't want to build a whole bunch of stuff in. And there's actually an infinite number of things that don't occur, an infinite number of constraints, like you can't have a banana in a sentence, right? That's universally valid, but we don't want, why make a theory that builds that in? So, there are theories with soft constraints, that violable constraints, but I think these just reflect markedness prejudices. And why do things like generate things and filter them out? I mean, this was done in syntax before, move alpha, and then filter out all the bad stuff. Why not just do what minimalism is doing now and build licit structures by finding the right algorithm for building structure? So I think naturalism, Chomsky's naturalism, leads us to the view that we shouldn't think of representations as needing repair. There's no sense in which a mental representation could be ill-formed or well-formed. It's just formed or it's not formed, right? Like a molecule is either exists or doesn't exist. So phonological grammars receive certain representations and output certain other representations, but there's no notion of repair. So to this, I say aye. Okay, so the last section I'm going to skip, but it's basically there's many phonologists saying that there's no poverty of the stimulus argument in phonology. And I try to argue that actually it's everywhere in phonology, but specifically anytime there's a case of bleeding rule ordering, you have an argument for poverty of the stimulus. But we'll save that for another day. And we'll conclude with, oops, let me jump to my conclusions. We'll conclude with, there's much more to phonology than what I've given you, right? Insertion and deletion rules and metathesis and syllable structure and stress. But the conclusion, there's no surprises, right? The relation between a phonemic system and the phonetic record is remote and complex. And just like in syntax, the essential properties underlie the surface form. I don't really think we should be, looking at output-driven phonology. There's lots of controversies, lots of things we don't know, but I think we can achieve some higher quality ignorance, as Stuart Firestein talks about. And I hope I've suggested that linguistic reasoning that phonologists use is similar to what syntacticians and semanticists use. So thanks, everybody, and let's have a discussion.
Thank you very much.
Nay.
Right. So just to remind everybody, the idea is now that we pass the floor to Hedde, who will raise a couple of issues he has prepared beforehand. So maybe Hedde, we can limit the discussion between you and Charles to like 20 minutes, 25 minutes as a max. So we also have some time for questions from the general audience at the end, right? Because we want to stop at 5 o'clock CET, kind of. So we have to fit all of that in. But please, Hedde, go ahead.
Yes, thanks a lot. And I think I can even do shorter. I prepared a number of things that I would like to discuss with Charles. And the idea behind it is that I looked at this talk, and I saw already an earlier version as well, I must admit, from the perspective of a syntactician and or semanticist. I consider myself somewhere in the middle. And then I saw a number of things that struck me as remarkably similar, but also therefore raising the questions that I, as a syntactician or semanticist in such a domain, would also wonder. So one of the things was what you told us about UG, universal grammar can be small. And this is, of course, something that is a thought that has been guiding minimalist reasoning for 2 or 3 decades already as well. The idea that especially from a language evolution perspective, it's very hard to assume that there's a very richly articulated universal grammar, and that universal grammar would rather be something that is small. And then the question is, okay, what is small? What does it contain? And a syntactician will nowadays say, well, maybe it's only merge. Maybe a slightly fairer syntactician will say, well, it's merge, but we also presume, and this is where, of course, things relate to your talk, there's also a set of formal features. And then the question is, okay, how many features would there be, and how would they be internally structured? I had a bit of a laughter when you mentioned the number 20. I was trained as a graduate school still in the final days of the principles and parameter framework, where the joke was always learning a language is nothing more than setting 20 parameters. Later on, Fritz Neumeyer actually figured out that an annual volume of linguistic inquiry already proposed at least 100 different parameters, so 20 might be on the safe side. Later on, principal and parameters were replaced by more feature-driven versions of the theory. The functional sequence was introduced. People were introducing it as a very small thing, but I haven't seen a fully elaborated functional sequence, but something tells me that there's going to be many more than 20 features. So my question to you, first question about universal grammar, and then I go on asking a few more things about features, locality, constraints, and maybe also the poverty of stimulus, is if universal grammar is small, what does it exactly, from a phonological perspective or within phonology, consist of? That's a set of features. How many would there roughly be? But also, what are the combinatorial mechanisms, and what else is there? We may want universal grammar indeed to be as small as possible, but one should be honest in how small is it really, and what do we implicitly or explicitly assume it to be part of?
Okay, thanks. So I think first thing I would say is that 20 versus 100 is not really an important difference, right? So, in terms of order of magnitude, right? So I'd have no problems believing that maybe there's 100 phonological features, because in terms of, we don't know how anything is stored in the genome, but in terms of the amount of information you need to store 20 versus 100 if you're using some kind of digital encoding, it's not like 20 versus 20 million, right? It's in the same, it's literally in the same order of magnitude from the way that term is used in science. So I don't think it, and of course the number of that are in the literature, people, it might be possible to collapse some. It might be that some need to be split. I mean, we don't know. So I assume that all the exact features that we've listed are wrong somehow. Some people say we need, ATR, advanced tongue root, but some people say we need RTR, retracted tongue root as well, just like we need separate features for high and low. There's many phonologists who don't adopt the binary feature model that I'm using, and they use unary features or privative features. Those are all possibilities. These are all open, controversial ideas. I think what I've done is I've just adopted this binary feature system and run with it to see what I can do. Can I apply my set theoretic notions? And any change, like if you adopt a unary system or a privative system, you're going to end up in different places. So it's really, I think I mentioned this at the beginning, it's the different proposals are incommensurable. Actually, Hammerberg, who I mentioned before, in his thesis, which is called, I think, The Background of Phonology, he has a really good discussion about the incommensurability of different phonological theories, and that we can't, if you just gotta make a proposal and see how it plays out. And so I don't have, I assume that the features I'm using are incorrect. I think I think there's been a misguided, I would say, sense of, no, not misguided. Let me rephrase that. There's various traditions. So one tradition is to try to use as few features as possible, and then ascribe differences in pronunciation in languages, like let's say the E of what I say before, German versus the E of Spanish, to language-specific phonetics, right? So the idea is we've got a small set of features or a small set of elements, and the E in Spanish and the E in German are representationally identical. So they're phonologically identical. But then if you believe in that, then you need another module. You need another module of language-specific phonetic implementation or spell out of the features. And that's a whole other module for that has to be learned, right? Because each one is specific to a language. So I've taken the position that you're better off not proposing that extra module with an extra learning process. Because why not just say that German devoices final voiced obstruents? Well, why not just say that's an aspect of German phonetic implementation, right? If you have language-specific phonetics, why do you need phonology at all? Just put it all into phonetics. So I don't know if I guess I have to say, yes, there's many things we don't know, but there's lots of people working on this from different angles for phonological UG.
Yes, thanks a lot. And actually, I would like to go on. I will not enter the discussion whether 20 is substantially fewer than 100. Personally, I've always been a little bit skeptic about numbers of primitives exceeding the number 2 or 3, but that may also be a personal taste or a personal prejudice. What I would like to continue is discussion on features. And the reason why I'm doing that is that for syntacticians or semanticists nowadays, features may be everything, in the sense that we assume that what lexical items consist of are features, that is properties of those features that trigger further syntactic operations, and that maybe also a particular combination of features in particular configurations may or may not lead to ungrammaticality. So syntax wouldn't be syntax without a set of formal or syntactic features, but still many questions within syntax have been unaddressed about those features. And I think in the spirit of these glowing lectures, the idea would really not be what can syntacticians learn from themselves or what can phonologists learn by talking to other phonologists, but also what could syntacticians learn from phonologists and vice versa. And so what I will do is like address a number of questions concerning feature architecture that are, I think, largely unanswered in syntax, and see what you as a phonologist may say about it. And the biggest question has always been, what determines a set of formal features? Is it just an arbitrary bag that evolutionarily happened to be developed as such, or is what a set of formal features is something that is constrained by other factors? So many people in syntax will assume that many, if not all, syntactic features have something like a semantic or maybe even a cognitive foundation. I mean, there's tense features, there's number features, there's person features in syntax because there's tense, number, and person in semantics. At the same time, it's also very well known that various semantic distinctions never ever get grammaticalized into a formal system. No matter how many cats and dogs are in the world, there's no verbal agreement that is different from the cat being a subject versus a dog. So what constrains a set of formal features, and what could be maybe a principled way of seeing what those features are? Other questions that I have, but I think I know the answer a little bit better, are cases like what kind of entailment relations do exist between formal features? So not every feature in syntax stands on its own, and a past tense feature is dependent on a tense feature, and also certain aspect features and tense features are sometimes not very well combinatorially, cannot very well be combined. And this, of course, restricts the number of featural combinations if there's particular entailment relation between features. And then my final question concerning features, and I think here I also know what your answer is going to be, which may be one of the many nays, but in syntax there's also discussion on whether the set of formal features should actually be given by universal grammar, or whether some or even all formal features could also be emergent during language acquisition. So does the language learner really start with a number of formal features at his disposal, or is the language learner also be able, for at least a number of features, to distill them out of the language input? And of course, that question applies to phonology as well. And so I would be very, very curious to learn your answers to these questions as well. Thanks.
Okay, let me try to answer some of those. So one of the I think the obvious question that always gets asked when you adopt the position of innate universal features is, what about sign languages? And the best answer to that is, I have no idea. It's a good, obvious question. Is it possible that sign languages have a phonology that's using the same features as spoken languages, but with just different input-output systems? That's possible, but I don't have anything else to say about it because I don't know. For the question of do the features in syntax have to be innate? Well, there's lots of discussion in the phonology literature that features aren't innate, suggesting that features aren't innate. They're just ways of encoding alternations, encoding patterns, right? So if you have PTK showing up as BDG between vowels, then what we call plus voiced is just a way of encoding this alternation. And if so we just use the features after we see these patterns. And the problem with that is that how are you going to notice the patterns? How are you going to detect the pattern that this is happening between vowels unless you have a way of describing vowels, right? You need to have features. You need to have a representational system to detect the pattern before you can see how segments are behaving, what the pattern is. So, for example, if you had I don't know, let's say T and A are being deleted at the end of a word, which is, these are two reasonable things. Are you going to posit a feature that makes T and A be members of a natural class? And I don't think, probably nobody would do that, but there's this anti-nativist view about features that they just are names for or labels for the patterns that occur in the data. But my position is that you can't see patterns in the data without the features in the first place. So I would imagine that that argument would hold for syntax as well. You can't detect a syntactic pattern unless you have some way with which to parse that syntactic pattern, that pattern. I think this is said, not by many people, right? You can't even start language acquisition without a way to categorize the data. So let me see what else. That's okay. The entailment relations. So one place where entailment relations among features came up in phonology was this idea of feature geometry. And feature geometry is a kind of organization of the set of features that groups them together in ways so that, say, all the features relating to what happens in your mouth as opposed to down in your glottal area are grouped together. And the idea was that you could have phonological processes that referred to these higher order nodes and would necessarily, so by saying that something is happening to the place node or the laryngeal node, that would mean that it was happening to everything that node dominated, right? So you have this organization of features so you could express in a simple way something that affected many features, like place of articulation, assimilation. The problem is that there are cases where that kind of entailment seems to fail. And so that's why I've gone back to basically the SPE view of treating the features as sets, that the set of features, that there's no internal structure among the features, that if, just because you're you can have something that affects coronality without affecting distributivity or something like that. That these entailment relations don't hold, right? So yeah, so typically, again, a lot of it also reflects markedness. So almost all of the time, sonorants like N and M and R, and then other sonorants like R and L, they're almost always voiced or underlyingly voiced. But yeah, I think it's Burmese or so there are languages that have voiceless sonorants underlyingly. They've got a contrast. So the entailment relations don't work 100% in phonology, at least. So I don't know if that's helpful or not thinking about syntax. So let's see. So I said you need features to see the patterns. I mentioned sign language, the entailment relations. Did I miss something?
I was wondering about the general constraint on what a set of phonological features could be, but we can also postpone that and move on with the discussion. It leaves that up to you.
You mean about the size or about the
features that we have in phonology and the features that we have not in phonology?
Yeah, I think the best. I mean, of course, there's now there's maybe some hope of detecting the neural correlates of features. I mean, we're a long way from that, but there's people, like Bill Itzardi and David Puppel and Phil Monahan, and who are doing, who know a lot of linguistics and know how to do the neuroscience stuff. So there might be a way to look for features in the brain, but we're just at the very beginning of such things. And it's also important to realize that there's something called the problem of the lack of invariance in phonetics and phonology. That this was discussed even by Lenneberg in the 60s, right? That the realization of a particular segment or a particular feature is very context dependent, right? So the amount of nasality on a nasal vowel is going to differ depending on whether the vowel is high or low. And so there's no straightforward way to say, oh, that's voicing or that's nasality. It's a very difficult task in phonology.
Okay, thanks. Lots of things to think about, but let's not have a complete back and forth on this thing. I will ask one more question for reasons of time. And this concerns what surprised me a little bit, but positively surprised me, was your view of minimalism, where no illicit structures were built and one wouldn't overgeneralize and later on filter out. When you look at the minimalist module and in relation to the interface, a guiding thought has always been that syntax can create many things, and that many what are ungrammatical sentences are actually sentences that are that crash at the interfaces, either the interface with semantics or the interface with phonology. So the idea would be that an lexically unvalued or an uninterpretable feature would crash in the semantic system rather than triggering something that would already be ill-formed within narrow syntax. Alternative views have also been proposed that those features should not be thought to be crashed at other interfaces, but rather within syntax itself. But I think the view that syntax only creates illicit structures and that there's no illicit structures created by syntax that could be filtered out by interfaces may not be shared by everybody in minimalism. Now, we don't need to have a discussion on
Well,
minimalism
I think
here.
let me say two things to that. One is probably the best answer is that was me being ignorant, and I was wrong. But I think there's still a difference between saying that a phonological representation is phonologically ill-formed. It's different from saying the syntax creates this, but then a different module, it fails at the interface, right? It doesn't say syntax takes bad things and tries to make good things out of them, right? So there's a difference there.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, but the truth is, I was being sloppy in saying this, and I hadn't thought about what
Or
you
it was
just.
my misunderstanding. It's indeed the case that nobody thinks that semantics or phonology will repair a syntactically ill-formed construction, but syntax may still create ungrammatical structures depending on your exact view of the minimalist
They're
argument.
yeah, okay.
But maybe this relates to me, and this will be my final question. Where do then constraints on what possible combinations are or what combinations that are universally ruled out lie? Is that only within phonology, or is that also within the interfaces of phonology and maybe phonetics or other modules? Just as in syntax, there are types of constructions like from the third verb from the right or things like that. They're all known from the literature. Make a sentence negative by just changing the word order. Those things universally don't exist. And the question is, why is that? And would that be part of where's the relation for those kind of universal constraints within the system? Or should that reside outside the system? This is my final question. So I would suggest that you answer that, and then maybe we can open the floor for discussion.
So just to clarify, so how do you account for things that we don't see?
Exactly.
Okay. So the simple answer is if I'm right with my examples of combinatorics, we really can't, right? We actually want our theories to be way more general than what we ever have any hope of seeing. And I think that's normal in science, right? We're trying to figure out, so in order to be seen, something has to not only be possible linguistically, but it has to be compatible with the human performance systems. It has to be acquirable. It has to be transducible by our ears and mouths. It has to be not overload our memory limitations, right? So there's no language where every word has 97 syllables in it. That would be impossible for our memory systems. And so we don't need to account for that because it's there's non-linguistic reasons why this could never be attested. Okay. So that's one thing that rules out unattested, apparently impossible things. And then like I was trying to show with the combining the unification and subtraction stuff, I think you always, in every scientific theory, you always want to go beyond the data, because somewhere in there, I don't know if I skipped it. Imagine if chemists only tried to account for the attested chemicals, the attested molecules, right? We wouldn't have plastics. We wouldn't have the new elements that have been created. Like I think plutonium was created in a lab before it was found in nature. And so chemists are trying to figure out general principles that will predict the existence of molecules or even atoms that have never been seen. And so I don't think it's a realistic goal to expect our theory to match this. I mean, Ron Kaplan talked about this at some point. He called it the seduction of substance. He goes, let's say you have a nice, elegant mathematical theory, but then you notice that certain things aren't attested. He says, you don't want to ruin your nice, elegant theory by making ad hoc constraints against this, and this, which it might be that those don't exist for reasons of, say, memory or performance systems and so on, right? So we don't want to, data fit too much. And once you look at the combinatorics, we definitely don't find languages with 97 high front vowels, but given the combinatorics, there are 97 high front vowels. So I think we're just going to have to be more Galilean in our linguistics and look for the abstract underlying computational principles and not worry so much about matching the attested data so perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, my question, then I will really stop, was more about like, should the underlying combinatorial system still make particular things impossible or not? So there's a difference
by
between
implication,
going beyond
right?
the data and anything goes. And
well, to quote something I said in the poverty stimulus section, right? There's a inseparable connection between the scope and limits of our minds. And if we propose, I mean, I like using playing cards as analogies. If we propose a system that only sorts cards by black versus red, then that allows us to group spades and clubs together and hearts and diamonds together. But it doesn't allow us to distinguish spades from clubs or hearts from diamonds. So whatever our system is, it allows us to do certain things. And by implication, it doesn't allow us to do other things. But that's going to be true no matter what kind of system we used. So it's not I don't call those constraints. I just say they're out of the scope of the system. So we will, we're not going to, no matter what phonological theory or syntactic theory you come up with, it's probably not going to make reference to prime numbers. So you could say there's a constraint against language making reference to prime numbers, stress the lowest prime number, stress the highest prime numbered syllable in a word. I don't feel like I need to explain that. It's just, I have a model that doesn't include prime numbers in it. And there's an infinite number of things that will never occur. So prime number stressing of syllables is not going to be there, but it's not a constraint. It's not a linguistic constraint.
I think there's plenty more space for discussion, but I think the two of us should stop here, and
Yes.
the floor should be open for general discussion. So thanks a lot, Charles, for a very great
Thanks, Hedde.
talk.
Thank you both, actually, for a very invigorating, stimulating discussion. We now still have some time for questions from the audience. So for that, I would ask Charles to stop sharing so I can actually see everybody and I can see who raises their hand. The way we want to proceed is that people who self-identify as early career researchers, and I don't know all of you, so I don't know if you are early researchers.
David, you're not.
But these people
Very
ask
definitely not.
questions first, and then we move on to everybody. You can also ask questions in the chat, so Andras will keep an eye on that. But let me ask, is there anybody who would like to ask a question now? Then please raise your hand. Let me see, who do I have here?
Harry, you're not early either.
I can't see the hands. Where are the hands?
Should I ask my question now?
Well, are you early research, Harry?
Oh, I missed something.
Right. Let's see. There should be no. Okay, well, in that case, I guess. Oh,
I'm mid technically.
Hi. Okay, mid. Go ahead.
Very quick. I'm very sympathetic to all of this. I love it. I was wondering about your thoughts about ineffability and phonotactics generally. Where do they live?
Okay, so ineffability, I have no idea. Phonotactics is another thing I say nay to. I'll give you my quick story about phonotactics. So phonotactics is often, so the classic example that, Binnick is not a possible word, but Blick is a possible word, right? And, if I take my brother, who's never taken a linguistics class, right? And I say, and he's a monolingual American, and I say, here's a word, pukahila, or something like that. Do you think that's Polish or Hawaiian? He's going to say, I think it's Hawaiian. He doesn't have a Hawaiian grammar. He doesn't have a Polish grammar. Somehow he has some sense from, commercials on TV and I don't know what else, and, beer drinking or whatever, about he's figured out something about something that sounds Hawaiian versus Polish. And So we can have phonotactic judgments, maybe accurate, maybe inaccurate, about languages that we know almost nothing about. And the more exposure we get, maybe with enough exposure, he'd be able to distinguish Hawaiian from Samoan or Polish from Ukrainian. But there's one language that he's had a lot of exposure to, which is English. So he has really strong phonotactic judgments about English, but I don't think that's grammatical. And in fact, people's phonotactic judgments about English are often, wrong. You ask people, can you have, PT words that begin with PT, and they'll say no, but then they say potato which seems to have a P, no vowel in between the P and the T. So I don't think that phonotactics is part of grammar in general. Because there's lots of things we can do. We can write limericks, we can make alliterating poems. There's lots of things we can do with speech sounds. We can characterize some of those things in terms of features, but I just don't think it's grammatical knowledge.
Okay, then we have family. You said you had the same concern, but you still want to ask a question?
Yes, I will type my answer in the chat box. Everyone, can you hear me well? I will chat.
You will chat.
Okay. Right, so while you enter your question in the chat, we can move on to Palab.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, so as you talked about features, how they are learned, I have two questions. The first question is about transitional probability. When someone parsing a sentence, the big bad wolf, when we talk, we don't actually know where is the pause, where the one sound is ending and when the new word is beginning. So there are studies, psycholinguist studies, and they're showing that people employ certain kind of transitional probability, the child they do it. So, and in a kind of way, if we think that this transitional probability, where it is happening, so this sounds, some sounds which are plausible to come together and some are not. So is it a statistical model of learning of words? I'm not talking about syntax, like words, when a infant of 2 or 3 years old, like they understand how they're formed. So this is the first question.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question. So I think you started out saying something about learning features, but I've specifically taking the position that the features are not learned, that the features are categories that we use the pre-existing categories that we impose on the signal, right? So they're not, so I don't quite understand what the question was.
My question is are children sensitive to the properties of their native language, like stress patterns, very early on? And if the segmentation problem, when we we hear a sentence, we segment words or constituents, so like a word can be at most like one primary stress, that kind of constraint, is it a statistical thing, how kids learn?
Okay, so I'm not an expert on this area, but from the little that I've looked at, a lot of this literature is based on strategies that might be used by children parsing English. And as we know, so if the structure of words and the phonological markers of words and word boundaries differ across languages, then that can't be. There has to be something more general that they're using before they get access to whatever the strategy that might work in English, right? You have to figure out that this strategy works in English first of all, because it's not going to work in every language. So there's got to be something preceding that stage that you're talking about. I don't know what it is, but in my discussion of the poverty of the stimulus, I mean, there's a lot of English bias in these studies. For example, who is it? Peter McNeilage, who's a psychologist, says, I think that children hear all the words that they're going to they hear all the words that they're going to need. Well, I gave an example of a Turkish word with 11 morphemes in it. or a Shona. David Oden told me that a Shona verb has 10 to the 33rd power forms. So it's not literally the case that children hear all the words. And the strategies for parsing are going to be different depending on all kinds of differences, where stress lies, where the stress is predictable, and so on. So I think before you can use a strategy for parsing that works in English, you got to figure out that it's English that you're dealing with. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So
So in the
another
meantime,
question I have.
I think we should move to somebody else. Okay.
we have to move on so people get a chance to ask. We also have a question in the chat now from Fam. So maybe do you want to read it out for yourself, or?
Okay, so when studying phonological competence, I want to find out which functions processed and algorithms are run by phonology. However, when I try to construct phonological rules, I would say I do need phonetics. I mean, without profound phonetic work, I have no idea which segments exist or whether phonological phenomena. Okay, so this is about, okay. So this is about the beginning of the talk where I said that you can't do phonetics without phonology. So there's a quotation from Bromberger and Halley somewhere, which I didn't have in my slides anywhere, but it says something like actually all physicalists, by which they mean anti-mentalists, all physicalists are actually closet mentalists. So they're talking about phoneticians. And so when they do, I think that I think you might be a closet mentalist as well, because you're probably when you're looking at the signals, you're looking for word boundaries, you're looking for segments, you're looking for syllable boundaries. You already have this preconception that these things exist. And so you're maybe trying to find correlates between phonetic correlates for these categories. But I find it hard to imagine that you're just looking at a waveform or a spectrogram without, before you can construct your phonological rules, you're trying to figure out, oh, is that, are those two segments that I hear, do they share a place of articulation or something like that? So I don't know if that addresses your question. Intuition doesn't work out when studying. I want to find out which functions. I tried to construct phonological rules. I need phonetics. Without profound phonetic work, I have no idea which segments exist. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I can't know exactly how you're doing this, but I mean, let's just go all the way to the basic level. Why do you think there are segments in the first place? Right? Because the segments, just take a naive person, not a linguist, and put them down in front of a recording on Pratt and tell them find the segment boundaries. And I mean, I make my students try to find word boundaries, and they hate me for it. If you try to make them find segment boundaries, there's lots of arbitrary decisions, right? If you have a vowel before a nasal, you get more and more nasalization. Where do you put the boundary? You have an F and an S blending into each other. There is no segment boundary in the signal. So I think you're probably assuming these categories. You're assuming at least the notion of segment. That's the best I can say for now.
Right. I think we should move on. We already have a whole lineup of hands. Okay, so it's Harry who was first, David, Heather, Kyle. Okay, so in that order, please go ahead. Harry, go ahead.
Thank you for your refreshing talk. It's good to question all these things. And I think a lot of the things at the beginning, many phonologists would agree with you, except maybe people working in laboratory phonology spheres. But of course, you get to points where there is controversy in the field. So one thing that comes to mind, one thing that I would have to answer to people if I were to defend you is what you're doing in empirical science. You make zero predictions about external languages. External languages cannot falsify anything that your model saying. So you're going to say, yes, empirical. The empirical domain is the brain. We have no way of falsifying claims about the brain, really. So aren't you approaching doing a form of mathematics or logic, set theory? So that's one question. The other one is...
You only get one. You only get one. There's very, very little time. You got to share.
Okay. Go ahead.
Marcus, do you agree with that? Yes. Okay.
Now I do.
Yeah, okay. So what I'm doing is well, I don't know. I mean, I could try to answer this on many levels. I mean, if I show you the Turkish vowel harmony facts, I mean, that seems, I don't know what you mean by external language. So I brought in some Turkish data. I mean, this is obviously not my analysis. And I said, people perceive these, they seem to use lar in some cases and ler in other cases to make the plural. And we find a correlation with these vowels. And we find that people, even though we put the same vowel between different consonants, and speakers will judge them as being the same vowel, even though, of course, we know they can't physically be exactly the same. I mean, all of that is empirical evidence. So really don't know what you mean by there's no empirical aspect to this. It's full of empirical reference to empirical points. If you have cases where you have a two-way surface well, let's take the other Turkish case that Sharon Inkles talks about. You have morphemes that always end in a T, morphemes that always end in a D, and then morphemes that alternate depending on whether the consonant is in a coda or an onset. It seems that that's as good as an empirical fact as any linguist is going to have, that you've got a three-way contrast in behavior. So I don't know what more you want than that. I mean, I'm appealing to linguistic data in the same way that everybody here does.
But your theory doesn't exclude any empirical data that would be in the scope of the set theoretic model that you're proposing.
I don't know. I think you're picking on set theory. I mean, everybody has.
No, I'm not picking on set theory.
I mean,
whatever theory you take,
SPE
there is no fact or no empirical circumstance in language that your theory wouldn't predict.
I have no idea what you mean, because it seems that whatever you're saying seems to hold about everybody who's doing phonology or syntax. I mean, I predict that there's no language that stresses the highest prime numbered syllable in a word. I mean, is that what you mean? I predict that, but so do you, I imagine.
Yeah, okay.
I don't see any difference in between us in that sense.
Thanks.
Okay. David?
Hi. Yeah, so there's something that bothers me about the talk, and I wonder if you could comment on that. I mean, so if there's one high level thing that I think sort of distinguishes generative linguistics from other philology and other approaches to language, it's the idea that we should be asking why questions, right, about everything we find. And of course, we're mostly not going to be successful in answering them, but a successful answer is of the turtles all the way down variety. We, have two ideas that have independent support, and we show that if you put them together, something surprising emerges that answers a why question about some third phenomenon. I mean, of course, it's more complicated than that, but that's the essence. And you do that when in this talk, when you were discussing, say, under specification, that and you had the implicit claim is that there's a variety of phenomena that out of which we can factor this common property viewed in a certain abstract fashion. That feels like linguistics to me. In the slides that are in like 74 and thereabouts, you don't have to go there, but where you talk about the idea that repairs feature in phonology, right? It felt like your argument against sort of the OT approach or the approaches that are similar to that sort of involved telling us not to ask a why question that they have asked. Right. So the approach was sort of ridicule. You said, it's like Aristotle's view that a lantern shines so that we don't stumble. Right. But of course, Aristotle's view makes perfect sense as an answer to a why question about lanterns. If we have reason to believe the universe is constructed for human convenience and we don't know anything about physics. Unfortunately, there's lots of evidence that the universe is not constructed for human convenience. So it's the wrong theory, but it's not intrinsically a bad theory about lanterns if you have no life experience whatsoever. And likewise, I'm just wondering why the theory that you're against here it necessarily has to be disposed of by I think you're legitimately claiming that it involves attributing goals, purposes, aims, and motivations. Right?
Okay,
It seems like the theory says, there's a notion of markedness, right, that cannot be satisfied in its totality in any language because there are many competing notions of markedness. And the exciting idea, which could be wrong, right, is that there's a function in the grammar that would be part of UG that permits learners to rank these markedness ideas. I'm not a phonologist. Maybe we can argue on many grounds that it's wrong, but I'm not sure about the lantern argument or the argument that it's attributing goals, purposes, and aims to grammars. That feels like ridicule rather than argumentation. And I wonder if you can respond to that.
Okay, so I think I could say three things. Thanks for making me clarify this, or try to. So one is, I didn't mean to ridicule, especially since all of these ideas I've held at some point. So I'm ridiculing myself if I am. So I think there's the best response comes from John Ohala, that many of who was a phonetician and actually a very kind of basically a theoretical nihilist. And I think, and what he said is a lot of these so-called markedness patterns that we see are very easily explicable in terms of perception and language change. And we've got phonetic explanations for a lot of these patterns that recur. And what he said is, in science, it's not good to have two explanations for something. So why would you want to build into your phonological theory, whether it's, and all this markedness stuff predates optimality theory by a lot. So this is not an attack on optimality theory specifically. But Ohala's point was, if we've got a phonetic explanation why this happens all the time and this never happens, or a diachronic explanation, then it's bad science to build it in, to redundantly build it into our phonological model. So that's one part of why I'm being critical of that stuff. Another is this whole idea of, yeah, sure, maybe it's in there. Maybe things like maintain contrast or ease of articulation are in there. But I think there's so many, as the quote from Morris said, there's so much evidence that language is bad as a communication code, right? How can you say that languages are trying to avoid redundancy and homophony when we've got neutralization and we've got scope ambiguities?
But the essence of OT is that these constraints.
It's not OT. It's not OT only.
No,
I
know, but the essence of the OT idea is, yes, there are many bad things, and we can't avoid all of them at once.
Yeah, but it's not clear that. But does functionalist reasoning ever help us explain syntax or semantics or phonology? And I think you have to make the case, because it seems to me that it's that's the problem with or the challenge with OT, is that since the constraints are violable, then you can always say, well, in this case it doesn't matter. But it's kind of opportunistic to invoke functionalist reasoning when it works and ignore it when it explicitly doesn't work. So, for example, why would you build into universal grammar the idea that front round vowels, like a French or German U, is bad or complex, right? So here's the thing. If you're learning English, then your mother never says U. You never hear this thing. Why do you need a UG hint for it? If you're learning French or German, UG is telling you something that's misleading, because you do have an U, or you have an U. So why would you solve the paradox of language acquisition, which is what UG is supposed to do, by building into it markedness statements that are either irrelevant, like if you're learning English, or misleading if you're learning French? It doesn't seem to help at all. And so these are the reasons why I find markedness and as you said, markedness doesn't seem to be something that we can generalize across languages. And I mean, years ago, Karen Reiss gave a talk at the conference I organized and said, yeah, it means this, 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 and this. We need more research, but it might be that it's an incoherent notion, because it includes things like typology, when children pronounce things, not necessarily when they acquire the representations, but when they pronounce things in a way that adults can recognize. So yeah, I didn't mean to pick on the OT people here. I think that markedness overall is a dead end. That's
I'd like to reply, but I fear that I can't. So thank you.
Yeah, we really should move on. Sorry, David. Heather, you're next in line.
Hi, thanks. This is super fun. And we know, I mean, Charles and I talk a bunch and we agree on most of this like abstract level of abstraction stuff, but it's the specifics that I find interesting. And I wanted to ask something about the fetishization of assimilation, right? So we're like, okay, assimilation happens all the time, right? Let's assume that lots of phonological rules are not assimilation, which I do assume, but not in the same way as you, right? One point there was that would make it kind of weirdly different from, say, syntax and semantics. I don't know any syntactic theories that allow for like some sort of triggering of passivization movement in the environment of a WH feature, or something like this. So like phonological crazy rules are already something that's pretty weird. But in your system, if you allow for absolute neutralization, then you allow for every featural change rule to be assimilation, right? You can say if E becomes O before N, then N is underlyingly specified for round, but then eventually in the system, that round feature gets deleted and then replaced with something that is not round at the end. So you have absolutely neutralized N's that are underlyingly round. And then you get nice
Right, but there's no
generalization that
wait,
phonological rules
wait.
are all assimilation.
It's not assimilation. It's not assimilation because the features that are being filled in, remember, assimilation is just the case where what you fill in happens to be in the environment, and that's not in the case you just gave.
But
If
it
E
would have been in the
before N-
environment if O is derived from the roundness of N at some point in the
N,
derivation.
you're saying? N as in Nancy?
N as
is
in Nancy, right? Because
round,
you
but then
can,
it's not round.
but N could be underlyingly round if you have absolute
Oh, yeah.
neutralization, right? Because at some point in the system, the roundness of N
Oh.
is deleted and then it's filled in at the end with
If you
minus
have,
round.
okay, sure.
Right.
So N,
So, but that's not really my question, right? I'm saying that your system allows for everything to be assimilation if you have absolute neutralization, where you have feature filling in the phonology before it goes to the phonetics, right? And this is one area where I think a lot of people have issues, right? You said, oh, if we have a phonetic system where you have to have language-specific phonetics, this makes it more complicated, right? But you've just pushed the complication into the phonology, where there's a position at the end of phonology where you fill in features for no reasons that are motivated necessarily in the phonology, because phonology allows for underspecification. Phonology doesn't care, right, if you fill in all your features. But I think if you look at the abstract structures of syllables, if you assume that syllables exist, right, then we have a war between what our abstractions predict that maybe tell us about what's going on at this phonetic phonology interface. Because one of the examples you brought up was like bdg, right? Pitaka becoming bdg between vowels, right? And most phonological theories do not allow for that to be assimilation, right? That is lenition.
but Heather,
in some way.
you keep referring to assimilation, but I don't see assimilation.
Okay, but this is important here, because if vowels and sonorants don't have the same kind of voicing as obstruents, which a lot of phonologists have argued, right? Then what is happening for pitaka between vowels becoming bdg is then becoming underspecified for voicing, right? And then at some point we have to decide to pronounce them as voiced. And if that happens in the phonology, what you're saying is that there is a point in the phonology where something that has been lenited, right, becomes feature filled, which means that the phonology is not treating that as a weak position anymore. There's something else in the phonology that's independent of the reason why lenition happened, that feature filling occurs, right? Or you push that into the phonetics, where we have to pronounce things anyway, right?
Okay,
Like,
Heather, can I, since you're my
so that's
good
my question. How do you tell?
I think this is too specific for phonological question for this crowd. I don't mean to be rude about it.
Maybe.
I
Right.
think so.
The general question
Let me
is,
give it. Let me
there
give
are
a
lots
quick
more
answer.
abstractions to take into consideration,
Just
right?
to give an actual content answer, I think that the idea that voicing in sonorants is different from voicing in obstruents, to me, is a sign of the fetishization of assimilation, because I think it's the fact that you sometimes don't assimilate voiceless obstruents don't assimilate to voicing of sonorants, but they do assimilate to voicing of obstruents, shows that everybody's thinking that that the failure of assimilation there must mean that there's a different feature going on. But I think this is too specific.
That's not the only reason why we don't.
Okay, okay. But I think this is too specific of a phonological question that you and I should discuss. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Good thing you live in the same place. Now,
Yeah.
last question, Kyle.
Hi there, Charles. So
Thank
I
you.
was interested in what Hedde had to say near the end about sort of classic poverty of the stimulus arguments about things like the third verb not being the one that's fronted. And then also I was thinking about what Harry had to say about is there anything that your theory doesn't predict? So I was thinking about your talk about about locality and anti-locality. Aren't there like perfect analogs that you predict? Like you probably can't have a sibilant dissimilation, but it's n apart where n is some positive integer that's not 1 or infinite, right? Do you make any predictions like that?
Oh yeah. So you can only have, yeah. So I mean, so to make it simply, I mean, just like, okay, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but as far as I know, like say long distance binding, has to mean local or long distance, right? Is there such a thing as obligatorily long distance binding where you can't be bound close, but you can be bound far? Does that exist? Oh yeah, that exists. Okay. Well, in our assimilation system, you don't get that, right? So yeah. So is that what you mean, Kyle? So you can't refer to explicit numbers of syllables away. You can't refer to. You can't obligatorily be. You can't assimilate to things that are far, but not things that are close. Is that what you? So
Well, yeah, sure, things like that. Like I'm wondering what the substantive derived predictions from that are. Like what about saying there'll be exactly n interveners when an assimilation or dissimilation occurs? Can you do that?
Yeah, no. So yeah, so you're helping me out here, right? All these things that I think we typically think of are too obvious to say, right? You can't count the number of syllables apart and things like that. So yeah. I mean, there might be things that say you can assimilate within the foot or within a binary foot to your left or something like that. But you can't have only assimilate to something that's the third syllable to your left or something like that. So yeah, there's lots of, by implication, there's lots of things that are not predicted. But it would take a long time to list all the things that are not predicted by the model. Yeah,
speaking of long times, we are already quite overdue. So let me ask again, are there any further questions maybe that somebody needs to ask now or else they won't be able to? That doesn't seem to be the case. So I think we'll end the official part of this now. I will ask